Hello everyone, I'm Chris Wynn and welcome to the ROKER RAPPORT podcast in association with Sunderland Community Soup Kitchen as we return after the international break to build up to our 6th League One fixture of the season, where we have a top of the table clash according to the early league table as we take on second place Accrington Stanley at the Stadium of Light. So to bring us up to speed with all the latest at the WAM Stadium, we are very pleased to have the company of Dan Jewell from BBC Lancashire. Hello Dan.
Hello there Chris.
Thanks for joining us, how are you keeping?
Pretty good, thank you. I'm glad the football's back. We've got lots of plates spinning in this part of the world in a very busy patch, and I wouldn't have it any other way.
I was going to say, you mentioned before we came on, I mean, how many clubs do you actually cover?
Well, from the Premier League to League One, we've got 7 clubs that we cover week in, week out, every game, as much coverage as possible, and pre-match, post-match, covering the matches, all that kind of stuff. We've then got 2 non-league teams in the National League North, and we've got, I've lost count, but in our official transmission area, something like 14 non-league clubs below that, and that's without counting areas of old Lancashire that are no longer part of the Radio Lancashire broadcast area. So if you were to talk about, traditional Lancashire, you'd add the Manchester clubs and Wigan and Bolton, Rochdale, and all these kind of clubs as well. So at the moment, we're on 7, and it's the biggest that the station's ever had. So We are really fortunate as well, because I personally like the fact that most of them are sort of Championship, League One, smaller clubs. You get a lot of access, and they're a lot more, let's say, collaborative in their approach to these things, whereas clubs can be a bit of a pain, to be honest.
Yeah, it must be good fun though. I mean, do you get to pick and choose, or are you just kind of given your assignment for the weekend and that's that?
It varies. It varies really. It'll depend on because of, without making this into a podcast about the BBC, because of the cuts that there have been, even in my time working for the BBC, we're no longer in a position where there's a correspondent for this club and a correspondent for that club, because we simply don't have enough people. I do a lot of Accrington games. That's just because I've done Accrington over the years for a long time, and my kind of area of responsibility is more East Lancashire. So I'll do Burnley, I'll do Accrington Stanley, and geographically it's convenient where I live to go to Preston North End, for example, whereas Fleetwood or Morecambe is a lot further away relatively. It's like a 3-hour round trip to go to Fleetwood, for example. So it's not quite as easy as that. But I always try to see all of our teams a few times a season. I was at Chorley against Gloucester City on Saturday in the National North, which finished 9-0 to Chorley, which was a first for me.
Wow. And I'm sure you've got your favourites over others, but I'll not ask you which ones you prefer over others. But I mean, I said at the top in the introduction about this being I know we're only 5 games in, Accrington have played 6 games so far, but top of the table clash in League One. Does that still sound a bit odd to the kind of local media talking about Accrington being in that position?
Well, it's a bit of a twofold one, to be honest, Chris, because it's too early in the season to talk about top of the table clashes, and I'm going to bust out the managerial cliche that you can't look at it until at least you've had a good look at half the league, 15 games, maybe something like that. But obviously, a fixture like this is going to be used as a benchmark or a barometer or a yardstick for Accrington. And when Accrington did get promoted from League Two, that was the inevitable question that John Coleman, the manager, got asked. You're going to be playing Sunderland in a league game. And so, yeah, of course, the idea that the 2 clubs are at the top of the table and, I mean, hypothetically, a winner would remain top of the table. Not that it would make any difference after 6 or 7 games, and you don't get any prizes for getting it. It's just worth 3 points the same as any. And I am sounding like a manager, though, and that's not the point in this. But as a sort of step back and take a look and take stock, and let's think about where the 2 clubs were, 20 years ago, for example. Yeah, the idea of Accrington and Sunderland being on a level playing field in every way imaginable, the league table tells you that, is one of those little milestones that'll make Accrington fans think. Or, to be honest, I think it'll make non-Accrington fans kind of scratch their head and rub their eyes a little bit, because I think Accrington fans have kind of got used to it, because since John Coleman took charge for the first time in 1999, They've had 4 promotions, and not 4 promotions. I do him a disservice. They've won 4 titles. He doesn't do apparently promotions without winning a league. He keeps telling me. So they've won 4 leagues. So over that relatively short space of time, they've known an awful lot of success. So there's been lots of these milestones along the way, and lots of these big clubs, and lots of these moments where you go, can't quite believe we're there.
I mean, if we're talking about kind of dreaming and looking how things stand, if we stop the league season right now, next season, Accrington would play Arsenal in a league game. But anyway, that's that's like I said, it's too early in the season. But you did mention actually going way back to those promotions. I mean, that was kind of between 2000 and 2006. Accrington went up, had 3 promotions in 6 seasons, like you said, and then 12 years in League Two, which actually probably an achievement in itself. But then to get promoted to League One in 2018, that was probably something that most Accrington Stanley fans couldn't imagine 15, 20 years ago.
Oh, no, absolutely not. The big dream, the big aim was always, can the club get back to the Football League after what happened in 1962? And it's very strange, or certainly was strange, maybe 10, 15 years ago going to Stanley, because there was a generation missing of Accrington Stanley fans. So there was the older generation who would have seen the old Accrington and gone to Peel Park and seen them in the 50s and the 60s. And then there was a young generation of supporters who'd maybe started watching them from John Coleman coming in, or maybe a little bit earlier than that. And kind of anybody in the middle, like my parents' age, there weren't too many of those. So it was a holy grail, and it's been 44 years since we got back in the Football League, and they did get back in the Football League, and it was wonderful. And then those years spent in League Two, the club experienced something that it wasn't used to, because John Coleman and Jimmy Bell left the club and went to Rochdale, and then there was Paul Cook and Liam Richardson and James Beattie, who all came in and had relatively short tenures, which were punctuated by, if not quite full-on relegation battles, certainly trying to consolidate your position and scramble away from those lower reaches. But after a couple of years, when John Coleman came back, he was very clear that consolidating and sitting in the middle of League Two was not for him. That's not what he wanted to do. And he managed to assemble players without a lot of reputation, without a lot of fanfare, and without a lot of, in some cases, pedigree, to be perfectly honest. And the unit was more than the sum of its parts. And actually, that season, 17-18, when they did win League Two, it was a continual recurring theme that you would go to away games, or you would welcome, visiting press into the press box at Stanley, and there would be this sort of feeling of, oh, it's great we've achieved, isn't it? And then kind of in brackets, or the subtitle would be, the novelty will wear off, the wheels are going to fall off. And it never really looked like it was going to happen. And it was conclusive, and it was comprehensive. And since, Stanley haven't been in a League One relegation battle. They've at times flirted with it, at times they've been down there and had poor runs, but it's never really been a realistic prospect of dropping out of the third tier, which is going some, particularly because of the changes that have been made to the club and the infrastructure. And you'll see when Sunderland come to Accrington later in the season, the ground is vastly changed. The pitch has been worked on. There's work going on a training ground. And these infrastructure-y things are almost as big as the achievements on the pitch. And the way John Coleman always described it was that previously the progress on the pitch was so emphatic that he felt like the football was pulling the club along, and it was like rolling a giant boulder up a hill and trying to keep it going. And now, belatedly, those things off the field have started to catch up to the point where, although it will still be a surprise to the ordinary observer of football that Accrington are in League One, and I quite understand that, there will be comparisons that you can make with, for instance, Burton Albion, who have put all that infrastructure in place and have developed, and they are on a level playing field. They are on a par of the things they've put in place to manage the football, and the football has continued at a level that infrastructure can work with, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And you mentioned those first couple of seasons in League One. And I think, what was it? The first season was 17th. The first season was 14th, then to finish 17th after that. But I mean, were those were those 2 seasons celebrated because, like you said, the progress was so rapid that, did everyone just think, well, it's almost a free hit at League One, and actually they're stuck there?
There's a difference, I think, between within the Accrington camp and what supporters think. I think if you said that to Coley or to his assistant Jimmy Bell or to one of the players, you'd have probably got a fat lip. I think a lot of Stanley fans who've been around for a while were genuinely thinking, well, this is brilliant because it means it's 2 relegations till oblivion rather than 1. And there's a very, you know this better than most people, there's a sort of gallows humour, worst case scenario amongst football supporters. And so I think there were a lot of Stanley fans that went, well, this is a bit of a turn up for the books. This is exciting, isn't it? We'll see what happens. But no, certainly among the players and the management and the owner, Andy Holt, who'd come in that season that Accrington won League Two, the idea of kind of every year we're going to hang on in there and finish 17th is not on the agenda whatsoever.
Yeah, and you mentioned Andy Holt taking over there. I mean, what was the state of the club when Andy Holt took it on?
Well, Andy will tell the story that he went as a sponsor to a pre-season game and he knew it was bad when there wasn't any beer in the bar. And he offered to buy some beer and ended up buying the club. How 100% true that anecdote is, I'm not entirely sure, but the club financially was, it was a hand-to-mouth existence, doesn't quite do it justice. They were impoverished and times were tough and fabulous people had kept the club running and kept them in the position that they were in through strength of character and goodwill and force of character, I suppose. And I know a couple of individuals remortgaged their house, had other businesses on the side to try and generate some extra capital. And it wasn't easy. The staff didn't always get paid on time. The players didn't always get paid on time. And Andy Holt came in and he took a long look at the books and he did his due diligence like he would with any other business. And then he started to make changes and he believed that Accrington could be self-sufficient. And with selling players, they've now reached the point where they pretty much are that. And there were some statistics knocking around, and I have got them somewhere, about the amount of money spent or generated from clubs in League One, and Stanley have just about been self-sufficient.
Yeah, and as well, obviously, it took over a few years ago, but I suppose, and I've read a lot actually from Andy Holt talking about football finances before the pandemic, and he said it was a struggle before the pandemic, but once that hit, how difficult was that for clubs like Accrington Stanley? Because, even clubs higher up the pyramid were kind of on the brink when football had to stop.
I think Andy probably approached it as he did with his other businesses. If you were a non-essential member of staff, then they used the furlough scheme. Whether you agree with whether that should apply to football or not is another debate entirely. But it was a skeleton. The beauty of it, I suppose, is that there's a relatively small number of people employed in the first place. So the overheads aren't massive. And the fact that they don't pay the players huge wages meant that furloughing them when there was no football, for example, was possible. The commercial side of things has improved immensely since Andy Holt took over. That gives you a bit of revenue that is more sustainable. And he's a successful businessman and has other businesses and other things that can help. I certainly don't think that he's sticking his hand in his pocket like Jack Walker back in the day and injecting money into the club. I think this idea of being as self-sufficient as possible is probably what's helped them get through. Because as soon as revenue started coming in, you sell a couple of players, then that puts everything back on an even keel. So it has been difficult. Of course it's been difficult. I think the pandemic's been difficult for the vast majority of people and certainly the vast majority of businesses. I think with that hand at Stanley's tiller, they've been on a course that they weren't going to deviate from. And although, it's not a popularity contest and Andy Holt's not bothered about being popular. You've seen his social media. So I don't think that'll have worried him one iota. He'll have made the decision that he thought was right for his business, which in this case happens to be a football club.
Yeah. Last question on Andy Holt, actually, because I was reading as well that, when he did take the job on or took Accrington Stanley over, he said he didn't want to become the owner of a football club, and he just did it because he thought it was, an important part of the community, and he wanted to step in and he wanted to help out and he wanted to do that. I mean, it's been has it been 5-6 years now he's been in charge there? I mean, it seems like he's got a big project on. Stadium's getting rebuilt. The club are charging forward. Can you see him just being there for the foreseeable future? Is that a long-term thing, do you think?
Well, I think this is the point of trying to make the club self-sufficient. When he came in, it was very clear that money was required to keep it going, and they needed Andy Holt to come in with some money and with his business acumen and with all that sort of cross-pollination of the other businesses into the football to help and use the accounts department for his existing business for the football club to save on doing that and do the accounting properly, all those kind of things. I think the idea is, and community is the word you used, and community is absolutely the right word, Chris, because that was the thing that from minute one until now, he will talk about more than any other. And his desire is not to get run down by a bus, just to be clear. But he would always say, if I got run down by a bus tomorrow, I want this club to be in a position where the supporters trust can step in and can follow the things that I've put in place and operate in the way that me and the people I've delegated authority to, like the managing director and the club secretary and the finance director, all those kind of people. And although it might not necessarily mean continued success, whatever that may be in football these days, it will be a club that is there as a community asset, and kids will be able to come and watch on a Saturday and be involved in the community trust and be involved in the academy, and there'll be a football club there, and we won't have 1962 all over again, or the sort of first decade, no, maybe the second decade of this millennium, they were sometimes literally turning the lights off and hiding away from the door when someone came knocking to try and get some money in, and they didn't have any money to pay out.
Yeah, he certainly turned it around on that front, and I mean, and when we come on to last season, because we talked about the first two seasons in League One, last season, Accrington were right up there early on in the season. I was looking earlier actually, and just after half the season was gone, they were only 2 points off the playoffs, but it kind of tailed off a bit after that in the later half of the season. They finished up 11th, 7 points behind the playoffs. Did they just run out of steam in the end? Was it kind of the size of the squad that let them down in the end?
I think there was a real problem with personnel. In October, November, they had 19 cases of COVID at the same time. That resulted in a 3-week layoff. And actually, when they came back from that, the form was pretty good and they went on quite a good run. I'm not sure there's enough study been done of the science of it, but then when it came towards the latter part of the season, there was suddenly an awful lot of injuries. And at one point, around maybe March time, there were double figures unavailable through injury. And I mean, Accrington Stanley, with the best will in the world, if you lose 11, 12, 13, 14 players to injury all at the same time, you're going to struggle. And what was more impressive was that the players that came in and stepped in actually did a pretty passable job, and the form was, not absolutely disastrous. And that was the kind of zenith of it. And it wasn't the case that 11, 12, 13, 14 players were out injured for a large period of time. But every time John Coleman got a player back, I think he felt like he lost another one, or somebody else had a setback. I mean, someone like Ross Sykes, for example, the young centre-half, who is actually quite experienced for a man of his age. He's only in his early 20s. He's played probably 80, 90 Football League games now, but he didn't play at all. He was a COVID victim. Then he got injured, and he didn't play at all from January. And that is, although a young player, a player that Stanley were looking at for the future and for the present, because the more games he plays now, the better he'll get, the more of an asset he becomes, the more it becomes possible come the summer that someone comes in and spends £1 million on him. But the idea that he wasn't available to play any part at all for 5 months of the season means that Michael Nottingham, who was playing right wing back, will have to play centre half, which means who's going to play right wing back, and so on and so forth. And it's just that accumulation of it. And I think ran out of steam is probably fair. And I'm sure it's a what-if scenario. I was speaking to the assistant manager just yesterday when he was saying, I just wonder what it would have been like if just one or two of those players hadn't been injured at the same time, and we'd have had a kind of core, a spine of those key men pretty much through the season with the supporting cast being disrupted, it might have been different, but it's a nice problem to have, as we discussed earlier. The idea that only finishing in the top half of League One is, not the worst situation in the world.
Yeah. And actually, when you were talking about it, that reminded me, I was reading as well that I think it was only 2 or 3 weeks ago that for the exact scenario you've just described, Accrington Stanley were fined by the FA for going through that.
Yeah, that's a fun one. Fined for getting COVID. They went on an away trip. I forget exactly where it was. Ipswich, I think, which is obviously a very long away trip at the kind of in the teeth of football restarting and the pandemic being as bad as it was, and they followed as many measures as were given to them, and they had to play the game, and they came back, and then within a couple of days of that game, we were talking 19 COVID cases. I think the thing that Andy Holt particularly, and John Coleman, was upset about is that it's not like it was only Accrington. It's not like Accrington had this outbreak and missed loads of matches, and they, were an outlier for what happened in football. Accrington themselves were on the coach ready to go to Doncaster on Boxing Day, and they got a phone call at 10 o'clock in the morning saying, we've got a COVID outbreak, the game's off. So it's across the board. Sometimes, having done this a long time and watched Accrington a long time, sometimes I actually think things like that are quite a good thing, because it helps that mentality of, right, sod you then. If that's how you're going to treat us, you don't want us here. We're a bit of an embarrassing sort of cousin from the countryside who are a bit small and a bit, not kind of the club that you want in your little elite club in this division. All right then, EFL. We'll use that as fuel, and let's see if we can cause you some more problems later down the line and bloody some noses. And that's certainly been the case with opposition and the way that they've been perceived by opposition in the past. Again, you've seen Andy Holt's social media. I think he knows what he's doing. I think he likes the idea of standing up for the little guy.
Yeah, I read that, and like I said, Sunderland went through different scenarios. I was just surprised when I read. I didn't know they were handing out fines for it, but there you go. And obviously, last season, when like I said, halfway through the season, looking good, trying to cling on to the coattails of the playoffs, and potentially a pretty special season. I imagine there was a bit of a buzz around the town, kind of coming, a festive season last year.
Yeah, it was exciting, and they were a good team playing good football, and they were no respecter of reputation, and so they go into every game with a degree of expectation that they would win it. I think because of the geography that we discussed earlier, Accrington is a small town that's not very well off at all, sandwiched between towns that are bigger with bigger football clubs in a catchment area that have got some of the biggest football clubs in the world. So it is a small, hard core, but those who follow Stanley, my word, do they follow Stanley? And I think those that regularly were seeing what Stanley were doing, not just last season, but that was the question you asked, were enthused by it and continue to be enthused by it. And this mentality thing of we want to shake off being little old Accrington is a complicated one, because John Coleman wants to shake off being little old Accrington because he feels like it puts a ceiling on expectations and he doesn't want that. However, as we've just discussed, sometimes being little old Accrington can be really helpful because people underestimate you, people think you are a certain way, people maybe dismiss you or write you off unnecessarily. So, yeah, I certainly think that there's still that gallows humour that we talked about before, where Stanley fans are going, oh, this is all right, isn't it? And where fans are going, wouldn't it be hilarious if we got into the Championship and hosted all these massive teams every week and had them all turn up and go, where the hell are we here then? But I do also think that there is an appreciation increasingly that you look out at what's on the pitch and it's a League One football team. It's a group of players who play at League One level and play really bleeding well.
Yeah. Well, you were talking about attendances there at Accrington Stanley, and I was taking a look at those because obviously with the steep rise that we talked about, I mean, 20 years ago, you're talking 500, 600 people coming through the gate, and I noticed last couple of years in League One, it's up to around 2,500, roughly about an average. But I mean, I've seen comments as well with Andy Holt saying, it's a bit of a struggle. You've talked about the geography, sandwiched between two big clubs, just down the road to even bigger clubs. Is that a bit of a ceiling, do you think Accrington have got with attracting fans?
No, I don't. I really don't. I think the point that I made earlier about a generation being missing. When I started watching Accrington at sort of 16, 17, there was quite a large cohort of people my age. And then there were people 40, 50, maybe, older than that, way back to vets who'd been at Peel Park back in the day. I think at the moment, lots of people who are in my age bracket are doing real life things. They're getting married and having kids and this, that, and the other. I am optimistic that there'll be Accrington Stanley supporters who are breeding Accrington Stanley into their kids and into their families and into their cousins and nieces and nephews. And something that Andy Holt has done that is fantastic is he gives away Stanley shirts for nothing to local primary schools to a certain age group. And it's not just that, Chris, and that gets quite a lot of publicity. What's also brilliant is, unlike every other football club I can think of, he refuses to change those shirts. So the previous Stanley home kit was 3 seasons in a row the same home kit, because he said, I've got kids, I was a kid, I don't want to give them something for free that at the end of the season becomes old and is the old one and they don't want to wear because there's a new one out. So they plan to do that again and have a longer lifespan and a longer period with the shirts in order to be able to kind of capitalise on that. And you only need a small percentage of those hundreds and hundreds of kids every year to go, Mum, Dad, I want to go and watch the Stanley. And you might get an entire family there that gets bitten by the Stanley bug, as somebody once described it to me.
Yeah, he's bound to get a handful of those. But, I mean, you touched on it earlier on, actually, with talking about the infrastructure. And I suppose, getting kids involved like that. And also kind of the youth setup. And like we've talked about, there's a new stand being built. But you hinted earlier on that, building that infrastructure is a bit of a slow process and isn't quite keeping up with what's happening on the pitch.
I think it's much quicker now than it previously was. I think that's been part of what Andy Holt has wanted to do. I mean, it's not many years ago that we were talking about the cowshed on one side of the ground and porta cabins for toilets and all that kind of thing. And there's the new Eric Worley stand has been open for a couple of years now, down one side. The Jack Barrett stand, which is the main stand, has now got all the development going on for boxes being put in and hospitality and a fans bar and all the infrastructure that goes with it. Stuff that you take for granted when you're a non-league team or you're struggling for money. Burger vans and pie stalls and bars and toilets and all this thing. Whereas back in the day, it was like, we've got Sunderland coming, it's going to be a big attendance. Can we get 50 Portaloos? That won't cost much money. Yeah, we'll just do that and stick them outside in the car park. Whereas now we are putting in place enough facilities for that many Sunderland fans to come to the ground and stand off a chance of being able to have a pee this month, rather than, queuing for an overflowing Portaloo in the chucking down rain in the car park in Accrington. Yep. So
I've been there before.
Indeed. So I think that has caught up a little bit. I think what makes it perhaps seem like it's been quite a slow, organic process is the expectations that football bring and the way other people in football do it and spend massive amounts of money on a stadium. It wouldn't have been out of the question for Andy Holt to go, what I'm going to do? I'm going to spend 4 or 5 million quid. I'm going to build a new stadium in an out-of-town retail park and we'll go straight in there. But he doesn't want to do that because he wants this community thing to be the most important thing. He wants Stanley to be at the heart of the community and where it is and have that traditional Stanley feel to it. And it's by no means in the town centre or anything like that, but it's where it's been since 1970 when they played their first game. And things like the training ground is a big deal. Accrington Stanley's never had a training ground, never. They've begged, borrowed and stealed local facilities, this, that and the other. And now they've got the lease on what was formerly a council parks playing field. It's not great. It's not going to be great. It's a council parks playing field. So what they're doing is concentrating on putting a fence around it so that Doris can't walk her dog on it, which was pretty much the exact words that Andy Holt used when I asked him about it. And then work on some of the playing surface so that you can have a half-decent pitch and accept the fact that it's not going to be ready yet. So they're not there. They're not training there at the moment. They're still begging, stealing and borrowing. They've been training on a cricket pitch in Preston. And that's been a decent local facility that's been available. And they've accepted the fact that they don't have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 million pounds to spend on a training complex. So it's going to have to take some time. And there'll be gradual improvements in the training facilities that they've got the lease on back in Accrington, back in the town. And hopefully by 2022, they'll be there and there'll be something faintly resembling a football pitch to play on.
Sounds like it's coming along. And in terms of the transfer window in the summer, it was a strange window for all clubs. I think, it seemed to take a while to really kind of kick in. But I was looking at the business Accrington have done, around 18 players coming in. That includes 5 loan signings and a lot of young players on free transfers, mainly from clubs in the Northwest who've been released. I mean, is that something to focus on?
With the 18 players thing, I explain this a lot to people because they go, 18 players, my word, that's a lot. And then you're quite right, Chris, with the age profile. For the first time, Accrington have an under-23 set up this season. It kind of came in last year and was for what they call bounce games and training games and that kind of stuff. They've actually entered the old reserve league, the Central League, and they are now playing competitive games and a huge raft. I mean, I've actually, weirdly, because I don't tidy up, got the squad list in front of me from taking it out of my notes the other day. And basically from about squad number 15 to about squad number 27, 28, you would all pretty much consider 23s players or players who fit that age profile. So John Coleman's always had this thing about Accrington being Battersea Dogs Home for footballers, and he brings in footballers that nobody else wants. They've been knocked about a bit. They've not had particularly great football upbringings, or there's been some sort of fundamental flaw that their previous owner hasn't been able to handle. And if you get enough of those in, you find a couple of diamonds and they allow you to go on to the next one. And I think that's the evolution of that, because he's nailed it with the first team. I mean, his transfer dealings, every year you go, there's 2 or 3 you go, who? What? Where? What? And in a year's time, at least 1 or 2 of those, you're going, yeah, he turned out to be brilliant. So I think this is probably the evolution of that. The idea that, yes, Stanley want to produce their own players from the club's academy, but it's an absolutely massive leap from playing in the under-18s to playing in League One in competitive games. And maybe this can be the bridge. So he's trying to give game time to some of those younger players. And yet there have been senior experience signings. And those loan signings you mentioned, the quality of those, not necessarily the players because it's too early to pass judgment, but where they're getting those loan players from. They've got 2 from Manchester City, for Christ's sake. This is Accrington Stanley we're talking about, and some loan manager, one of 47 loan managers loaning out 127 players at Man City, has gone, yeah, Accrington, that seems like a really sensible place to send one of our young millions and millions and millions and millions of pounds worth of talent. And the goalkeeper, James Trafford, has been superb, and his attitude couldn't be better in terms of he's come out, massive smile on his face and gone, this is completely different to everything I've seen in my football development, and I absolutely love it.
Yeah. And that James Trafford you mentioned, 18-year-old from Manchester City as well.
Absolutely, yeah, 18. Because... And Stanley's 3 goalkeepers, I think they're 18, 20 and 19.
Well, Sunderland have signed a 17-year-old from Manchester City, and he's been the best player on the park in our games so far. So it's unreal, isn't it? But just trying to break it down then, because looking at the more senior signings, Harry Pell from Colchester, John O'Sullivan from Morecambe, and I'm trying to look down the list, probably Ethan Hamilton from Peterborough. So other than the loan signings, are those kind of the main 3 who are looking at getting first-team football?
Yeah, well, Harry Pell's played pretty much every game when he's been available. He's had a couple of games out through knocks. Unfortunately, John O'Sullivan's been injured pretty much since he came in. It's his 3rd spell with Stanley. You know what you're getting with John O'Sullivan, and he won promotion with Morecambe and then has come back to Accrington for a crack at League One. I think you're right in identifying those sort of more senior guys to add to the spine and the core of the team that has been there previously. And the loan players will be important because there's absolutely no chance that Accrington are paying the money that some of these lads are getting paid, but to pay a proportion of it in a loan deal. And a loan deal that, let's be honest, in January, if they were rubbish, you can go, yeah, we'll send them back. Thanks ever so much. That one's not worked. If you're giving them 2-year deals, you're stuck with them. If you're not giving them a 2-year deal and you can get rid of them in January, that makes that deal a little bit better. And law of averages says a couple of loan signings will be great. A couple of them might not be the best. But it's a gamble worth taking if it's not going to break the bank.
Yeah, and you can put 5 in your match day squad, so it's worth taking that taking that punt, isn't it, on that? But yeah, and I saw a comment as well last year. I can't remember whether it was from John Coleman or Andy Holt, but one of them stated that the wage bill was in the bottom two. It was bottom two wage bill of League One last season. Is that going to be the same again? Is that kind of there or thereabouts?
Yeah, I would imagine so. I don't know. I don't know exactly the figures that we're using here, but it won't be dramatically different to what it was last season. And I'm not massively sure that's important, to be honest. In the same way as I'm sure Sunderland get absolutely slaughtered for the amount of money that gets spent, and look at that stadium and look at the resources and look at the infrastructure, blah, 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 blah. It's about the team that you put out on a Saturday afternoon or a Tuesday night. And if you find a way to get players that can do that job on whatever budget, then you're doing your job. And that's the manager's job. And it goes back to the thing I said about John Coleman wanting to dispel Little Accrington. He doesn't want to keep going on about it. There are times, like this weekend, when it is blindingly obvious. And my first trip to the Stadium of Light watching Accrington, I'll tell you this tale because it kind of sums it up. In one of the many press rooms at the Stadium of Light, and I do emphasise the word many, and you can ask me later how many press rooms there are at Accrington. I was wandering through with a colleague, me and my colleague, the only visiting press, just two of us, and a few of the Sunderland guys were sitting round a table. It was fairly early in the season, I think, if memory serves me correctly, and they were really impressed. And this conversation was going on about how impressed they were that since relegation, Sunderland had trimmed the wage bill by... And they did give the figures, and I can't remember the figures, but they were impressed that the wage bill had been trimmed by 2 million quid or something. And me and my colleague were just walking up all those stairs to the back of the stand to go to the press box. And I looked at her and she looked at me and I said, how long would that pay our wages, the reduction in Sunderland's wage? And it was like, yeah, probably about a year and a half, I think. It was something like 2 million quid, and Stanley's wage budget was 1.1 or something at the time. And that does kind of bring it home. But Wickham have done it. I mentioned Burton earlier. They don't spend fortunes. They haven't spent fortunes. They've got out of this division. John Coleman's favourite one is, if it was about money, it would just be two chairmen throwing checks at each other. And it's not.
Yeah. Again, it shows the kind of job he's doing. But just looking at the departures as well, I read that John Coleman wanted to keep Cameron Burgess at the club, but he left to go to Ipswich for an undisclosed fee, of course. They always seem to be an undisclosed fee at the minute. But was that a bit of a blow over the summer to lose Burgess?
I think the fact that he's left-footed, he provides balance on the left-hand side of a back three. He'd been one of the better performers last season. That is obviously a blow. And we talked about senior players and players with experience earlier. He was one of those. I think possibly it's the lesser of two evils. If you get an undisclosed fee, £750,000 for Cameron Burgess, that can go a long way in helping all of the things that we've talked about, recruitment, but things off the field as well. But I tell you what, Chris, what it does mean is that when Peterborough come on deadline day and say, here's an undisclosed fee for Colby Bishop, Andy Holt can turn around to Darren McAntony and say, how about no?
Yeah, I was hoping for a number because I've been searching all day to try and find
it's somewhere in that ballpark.
Right, okay, fair. No, I'm glad I've heard that because it's driving us around the bend trying to find a number today. But I mean, take into account, all of that business been talking about last season where they were on the brink and then tailed off for various reasons. I mean, this summer we'll go back to before a ball was kicked. What was the expectation for Accrington Stanley?
Not for the first time. I think it's hard to stick a pin in that. I think if you ask a lot of Stanley fans who've been around for longer than the League Two promotion, they would say, will we take just avoiding relegation? If you're being pragmatic about it, yes. If you were to ask John Coleman, he would say, well, we were on the cusp of the playoffs last season. Why can't we get in the playoffs? I think last season's finish, 11th, was the highest the club have had since the 1950s. I'm aware it's not technically the same club because it's a different company, blah, 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 blah. It's the same.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
It's the same fans, it's the same people, it's the same community. So since the 1950s, and that's a massive deal. And I think if, for a long time, John Coleman and Jimmy Bell had a record of improving the league finish every season. And that is something they were really, really proud of. And it's not quite been able to continue, give or take a few places. But that's what they will always aim to do. And I think top half of League One, can't believe 17-year-old me is sitting here somewhere looking at me going, I can't believe you're about to say this out loud. But top half of League One, to me, feels like a good outcome, but it's not an outcome that would have me going, my, that's incredible. We're in the top half of League One. It's Accrington Stanley. So somewhere around about last season, maybe with fewer mishaps and fewer COVID layoffs and injury layoffs, maybe a little higher. And I'll be honest, Chris, I wouldn't be staggered. If they finished in the top 6.
Well, I mean, like I said, they've got off to a cracking start. 4 wins in the first 6. But have the performances been kind of a reflection of the results so far, or have they got another gear, do you think?
Oh, without question, yeah. John Coleman is famously fairly grumpy in post-match interviews, particularly when Stanley have won. And he's taken that to new heights in recent weeks, where they've won all of their home games. And after every one, he's come out and said, we can play better than that. I'm not going to attempt the voice, by the way, because he hammers me for my Scouse accent, so I'm not going there. But he's come out and said, there's more in us. We've got a lot more. We need to be more clinical. He's been frustrated that they've taken 1-goal leads and then the games have kind of petered out. It's not been the Alamo. They've not been, forced to defend for their lives, but they've not been super comfortable. That comes from going and nicking another one and winning 2-0 or 3-1 or whatever. I think if you look at the basic facts and figures of it, I think they've only scored 6 goals. And that is something 1-0 wins win your leagues, people say. And I can agree with that. If you're scoring a goal a game, are you going to get promoted? No. Not unless you've got an incredible defence.
Yeah.
However, the other way of looking at that is Colby Bishop and Dion Charles, between them up front last season, got somewhere in the region of 30 to 35 goals. I think maybe 32, 33 in all competitions between them. They've got 1 each at the moment. Now, I don't envisage that's going to continue with them being in single figures. I think Charles particularly goes on little streaks where he'll get 4, 5, 6 in 4, 5, 6 games, and then he'll go quiet for a bit. Lots of strikers are like that. I find it difficult to believe that the way that they play and the personnel they've got at that top end of the pitch, that they aren't going to score more goals, and there isn't more of a sort of 4th, 5th top gear, whatever you want to call it. I also think it's worth noting that they've changed slightly the way that they play. Although the system is the same, the 3 at the back and the wing backs, losing Mark Hughes in the summer, who was he won't mind me saying this, an ageing centre-half with no pace, but was a terrific footballer and could start the moves from centre-half and would almost be the playmaker that deep in the pitch and would get them going. They don't have that now. They have a combination of 3 defenders from about 4 or 5 choices to play in that 3-man defence who are head it and kick it men. And call me old-fashioned, Chris, I'm fond of a head it and kick it man. But you're not going to ask them to play out from the back because disaster will ensue. So there's been a little bit more work done on using the wide players, sometimes using those front men that I've mentioned and going a little bit more direct. I think the crucial thing is you'll see 2 or 3 Accrington games and you might see 4 or 5 different ways of approaching it within those games because they are very pragmatic and they're not wedded to this is our philosophy and any of that modern day nonsense.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that because I used to be a head it and kick it man myself when I could run back in the day, but that was quite a few years ago now. We said they've getting off to a good start. We talked about last season and what happened, and you said that the COVID infections had a lot to do with that. But I mean, in terms of their squad, do you think they're better equipped this time around?
I think they've kept the spine of that squad. They've added the goalkeeper Trafford, who we've already mentioned, who at this early stage looks like a terrific addition. Nathan Baxter they had on loan from Chelsea last season, who was terrific, but then was one of the many injury victims and didn't play again after about February time. They are pretty comparable in terms of their ability. Burgess has gone, but a couple of centre-halves have come in. Sam Sherring on loan from Bournemouth has played a couple of games, looked all right. Harvey Rogers has gone in there. He's been with the club a long time, but has never really got a run of games. He's been playing right back or wing back, and he's gone into centre-half and done well. Pell's come into midfield and been excellent. I think what's telling, I mentioned O'Sullivan before, Seamus Keneally, for me, although I think he's 33, 34 now, the Irish captain central midfield player, is crucial. And he's the kind of player that no one ever notices, and then he doesn't play, and everyone goes, we're getting overrun in midfield, what's going on? And it's because he does those things like nicking the ball and passing it 5 yards, or making an interception, making a block, and he hasn't played this season. And that is something that would cause Stanley fans to come out in cold sweats last season and the season before. What's credit to them is that David Morgan and Harry Pell and Matt Butcher as a midfield three in there have found a way to make it work. And if Seamus Keneally was fully fit, one of those three wouldn't be playing. So there are areas where they look quite strong, Chris. Centre forward, I mentioned Charles and Bishop. They've brought in a couple of loan players, Mumbongo from Burnley and the young lad Javan Malcolm from West Brom. Those two are unknown quantities. But one of the two of them, if they turn out to be decent, you've suddenly got three viable centre-forward options when you like to play two up front, when, with respect, last season, if you didn't have Charles or Bishop, you were probably putting a square peg in a round hole. So there are a lot of young players in there, the under-23s things that we mentioned. Maybe the 13, 14 senior core players are stronger this season. If you keep them all fit, if you get O'Sullivan and Keneally and Joe Pritchard's out injured at the moment, and he, up until he got injured, was probably Accrington's best player this season. If you can win games with those three missing, all of whom would pretty much start in your best team, I think that's probably a good sign, but it puts pressure on them.
Yeah. And I mean, this might be kind of Accrington Stanley's fans' worst nightmare scenario talking about this, but we've talked a lot about John Coleman and his record, and he's done an amazing job in Accrington. And from an outside point of view, it just looks like a perfect fit. John Coleman just looks like a perfect fit for being manager of Accrington Stanley. I've read it as well, how much he gets along with Andy Holt. They have a drink on the coach on the way back, they're good friends. I mean, can you ever see John Coleman maybe getting tempted by taking an offer if there's one there, or do you think he just wouldn't leave Accrington Stanley and he'd be loyal to them?
When he went to Rochdale in 2012, he said, "I don't want to be Ken Barlow." And I think now he's realised that there's not much wrong with being Ken Barlow if you do a good job of being Ken Barlow. And this is the sad state of some areas of football, Chris. I don't think that John Coleman's reputation is such with the people who make decisions to appoint football managers at football clubs that they would consider John Coleman for their clubs, regardless of the unbelievable job he's done for 20 years in two spells coming up this Christmas. Mm-hmm. So there will be a time after John Coleman, but by then, the legacy of John Coleman and Andy Holt will hopefully be that the infrastructure is in place, the foundations are in place, and who knows? There may even be a coach in Stanley's system already, whether it's Jimmy Belly's assistant, John Doolan, the first team coach, Jed Brannan, who's the under-23s coach, all of whom are former Stanley players as well, all of whom have got that link to the people. They're all Liverpool fans, apart from John Doolan, who'll beat me to death for calling him a Liverpool fan because he's an Evertonian. But that Liverpool model of the boot room and producing coaches as well as players, who knows? But John Coleman has been quite open in saying that he doesn't expect to go anywhere, and he's a granddad now. And to be perfectly honest, if I can be inarticulate for a moment, I'm not sure he could be arsed with it. I'm not sure he could be arsed with going in and the pressure and the nonsense that he would get from a new group of supporters going, "Who's this old, bold Scouse fella?"
Yeah, and a new owner as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I'm just glad you've set homework for every listener who's under the age of 25 who needs to look up who Ken Barlow is.
There
now.
You go.
That's their assignment. So this Saturday, how do you expect them to approach the game on Saturday at the Stadium Light?
Well, what they won't do is worry too much about Sunderland and the way that Sunderland play, or give too much heed to the surroundings and the atmosphere and stuff like that. Stanley will go and play in the way that they want to play. You will see all of the things you would expect to see to try and get the home crowd either quiet or ideally on the Sunderland players' case. It will be a very different prospect to go in there behind closed doors last season when it was an absolutely terrific crackers game of football, by the way. If it had had fans in, it would have had a bit of everything. But I suspect the game wouldn't have panned out like that with fans in the ground. Hypothesis again. They'll look to play to their strengths, which, as I say, the front two are a handful. And I know that Colby Bishop gave Sunderland a handful last time at the Stadium of Light. And they will try to keep a level of defensive solidity that in the majority of the games this season they've displayed. Not in all of them. There've been a couple of games. I mean, there was shocking at MK Dons, and in the first game of the season at Wickham. So the away games, a couple of them have been a concern. There is this balancing act to be had between, we want to go there and try and win the game. I don't care if it's Sunderland or, somebody in the Northwest Counties. We're going to approach it the same and go and win it, and it's a game of football. But there is still, and you can't get away from this, everybody outside of Accrington Stanley expects Accrington to go to Sunderland and get beat.
Yeah, a lot's based on, 100 years of history rather than...
Yeah, absolutely. and this is a little game that we play following Accrington around the country, where you wait for the first mention of clubs like Accrington or it's Accrington Stanley in the context of, they're very small, aren't they? And sometimes you don't even have to go on social media. Sometimes it happens in the press box. And as you say, I understand it. I understand why you would go, but it's Accrington Stanley. But then what you're not doing is looking at the league table and the results and the performances and the players and the manager and all of those things that are actually football measurable. And it is why we have league tables and a pyramid and promotion and relegation. Yeah,
that's the beauty of the game, isn't it? Having teams like that coming through. But you mentioned, just quickly, because I was reading about that performance at MK Dons. So it was important that they bounced back on Saturday and beat Shrewsbury at home. And that was a big one after that MK Dons game.
Yeah, and it was a big one given the international break and that I think there were only 3 games in League One. And John Coleman was not impressed that Stanley had to play, because so many clubs have had games called off when, somebody who sits on their bench or is in their squad gets called up by the Cape Verde under-21s or something. And Stanley lose Trafford and Charles, who would start every game basically and be among the first names on the team sheet. And again, there was a degree of, if this was a club with a bigger reputation, that maybe this would not happen. Maybe you wouldn't have to play the game. But it was, at least to an extent, mind games. They won the game, professional performance. He didn't think they played great. That's probably a good sign.
Yeah, and you've mentioned quite a lot of names who've been in the team, but who's in form? Who's the danger men that we should be watching out for?
I think I mentioned Ross Sykes earlier. If you watch Sheffield United under Chris Wilder a couple of seasons ago, the idea of one of the centre halves galloping forward and playing like a full back or a winger at times, that's been entertaining. He's a big gangly fella. It doesn't look the most graceful all the time, but it's been effective. And there has been more than one occasion where midfielders on the opposition have sort of looked around and looked at the dugout like, where's he come from? Where's he going? What's all that about? He's a terrific young prospect. Trafford, the goalkeeper, is excellent. Harry Pell will get booked. That's, water is wet. Bears defecating towards the Pope's a Catholic, and Harry Pell will get booked. But he's a combative, big character in that midfield who the biggest compliment I can pay him is it feels like he's played for Accrington for years and he's played 6 or 7 games. You can't go beyond the supply line and the finishing. Sean McConville scored his first goal in what felt like about 25 years at Sunderland last season. He'd been out with a very serious Achilles injury that could have been career-ending at his age. He then got COVID, which was par for the course last season, and he battled his way back, and he had the misfortune of sitting next to me in the commentary box for the majority of that time that he was out, so he was absolutely desperate to get back on the pitch. I'm not a stats man, Chris, but I did quite enjoy that there are only 2 players in the whole of the Premier League and the Football League to have had more assists than Sean McConville since he came back to Accrington in 2015. If you're interested, Nicky Adams and some bloke called Kevin De Bruyne. But I don't remember him playing for Northampton on a Tuesday night. Anyway.
Couldn't hack it.
No, exactly. So McConville's supply and Bishop and Charles have the potential and the ability and the track record to score the goals. They haven't done it this season so far. The longer it goes on without that happening, the more questions will be asked. But they are the sort of combination that Stanley can make the most hay from. And that's a little in-joke because Sean McConville used to use the phrase make hay in commentary all the time, and he got the mickey taken ferociously by his teammates. So I have to use Sean McConville and make hay as much as possible.
Well, I'll not ask you for a prediction for the game, but what I will ask you is for a definitive prediction on whether Accrington will make the top 6 this season.
It's the hardest question you've asked me, Chris. I think they probably won't, but I don't think they'll be far away. I think it only needs one or two of those 13, 14 core players that we've talked about to get injured, get bought by somebody, go off the boil, whatever these variables can be. And without wishing to sound like I'm taking the mickey out of a Sunderland supporter on a Sunderland podcast, there are now so many, quotes, massive clubs in this division that at some point, 6 of them have got to get their act together, haven't they?
Yeah. And actually, we were doing predictions on League One in the summer. And when you started having a look, there's 10, 12, maybe even more teams you could in the mix where you could say, well, they could make the playoffs, they could make the playoffs. And I mean, even looking at the early League One table, obviously Accrington doing well, but you look at Ipswich, I think Doncaster down the bottom. So it hasn't sorted itself out yet. So yeah, there's a long way to go. But are you making the trip up?
I am indeed, yes.
Good stuff. Looking forward to it.
Always look forward to it. It'll be far better with spectators in the stadium. It was one of the weirder experiences behind closed doors. I was really lucky that I did 60 odd games last season behind closed doors, and I told myself I'd never get used to it. And it was things like going to the Stadium of Light and there being 25 people knocking about before the game that made me not get used to it. As I say, the game was terrific, but it does make you a little bit self-conscious when I was doing the commentary with Joe Pritchard, who I mentioned earlier, who was injured at the time, who actually missed the first 5 minutes of the game because the Stadium of Light is so vast that he got lost on his way from the dressing room to the press box. So I commentated on my own for the first 5 minutes, by which time Accrington were already a goal down, I think. And when Stanley scored and Sean McConville scored the equalising goal, and all that meant to him and all that meant to us because we know him really well, I was acutely aware of the fact that we were the only people in the entire stadium making any noise, apart from the Accrington players who were celebrating on the pitch. Not a feeling I was fond of, Chris, I'll be perfectly honest. It made me really rather self-conscious, and when you look like I do, being self-conscious is not a good idea. So I'm really looking forward to the atmosphere. And the one thing that I hope everybody can remember, whether you're an Accrington fan, a Sunderland fan, an Ipswich fan, a fan of Gloucester City, who I watched lose 9-0 at Chorley at the weekend, we can go to these games now and we can be there and we can enjoy it and we can experience it and we can smell it and we can taste it, and we don't have to watch it on a computer screen watching, let's be honest, not a great stream of the game that is not in any way a replication of what the experience is like. And I don't know what your experience has been like, but I certainly feel like supporters generally have had that feeling of, I'm excited to be here. There's still that, come on, entertainers, and there's still that getting on your team's case after 15 minutes when they misplace a few passes, because that's part of the deal. But I've really, really enjoyed that feeling of there being a buzz around the place, and all the games I've been to so far have had that kind of buzz that you have before the first couple of games of the season when everybody's got that optimism. So to be able to go, and I don't know how many people will be there in the Stadium of Light, but to be able to go and play a part in that and experience it firsthand is great. But I do have to add the legal disclaimer here that this is not an Accrington Stanley coming for a day trip, we're coming to this big club, etc., 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 etc. It's just great to have football again the way it should be. Yeah.
And I mean, if it's like the game so far this season, should be expecting a decent 30,000, maybe just maybe a little bit higher, because we're on a decent run. But actually, if it's anything like that 3-3 that you're talking about, we might have a game on our hands.
They've all been decent actually at the Stadium of Light between these two teams. The 2-2 that was on TV was as I remember it, a terrific game. I remember the Sky coverage being like it was an FA Cup third round tie between a Premier League team and a team from the Step 7 or something. But apart from that, I mean, I didn't have to watch it because I was there, but I did see it back subsequently. And I did have Stanley supporting mates who were texting me while I was commentating going, you want to see what they've done again now? They've just done a milk advert joke. Yeah, of course they've done a milk advert joke. But the actual games, even the ones that Stanley have lost, have been pretty entertaining. I've killed it now. It'd be 0-0. It'd be an absolute shocker, but I've enjoyed them.
Yeah, well, we'll know who to blame if it is. But I hope you have a fantastic weekend. I hope you enjoy your trip up.
Yeah, absolutely.
And enjoy the experience. But on that note, just want to say thank you very much, Dan. It's been an absolute pleasure, and all the best for the season ahead.
Been great to chat, Chris. Thank you.
Cheers, Dan. And thanks again for listening. Keep a lookout at ROKER Report for all the build-up ahead of the game against Accrington on Saturday. But from us, it's bye for now.